Good evening and welcome to our annual GWPF lecture in normal times. This event has always been the highlight of our year. Regrettably, this year we are unable to welcome our members and supporters in person due to the Corona-19 restrictions. Yet despite these circumstances, I'm sure the 500 or so guests from around the world who are joining us tonight will find this year's lecture as thought-provoking and as enlightening as usual. Today's postmodern culture is almost completely controlled and dominated by collective fear and relentless scaremongering by activists, politicians, and the news media. Not since the apocalyptic consensus of the European Dark Ages have the prognostications of impending doom, global catastrophe, been as widely promoted and accepted as today. It's not surprising that a rising number of children and young people have been treated for eco-anxiety. Doomsday cults such as Extinction Rebellion and apocalyptic child prophets such as Greta Thunberg have caused a tsunami of young people seeking psychological help for depression and existential anxiety. Like in the Middle Ages, armies of radicalized witch hunters nowadays are sniffing out and tracking heretics who refuse to accept their doomsday prophecies. It is therefore increasingly important for the public to understand the role and the societal impact of fearmongering, a topic Professor Frank Furedi has researched and published about extensively in recent years. It is my great pleasure, therefore, to welcome Frank Furedi to deliver this year's GWPF lecture. Over to you, Frank.
Thank you very much, Benny. What I want to do today is basically talk about what we sociologists call the cultural script of fear. And what a cultural script really is basically the kind of stories and resources and narrative that society communicates to everybody at all levels, from children to adults. And the kind of cultural script that I'm discussing is basically one that looks at what is good in the world, what is threatening in the world. A cultural script can give us confidence, or it can reassure us. Sometimes it can do the opposite and makes us very, very scared. And one of the things that I've been researching for a very long time is the cultural script through which fear gains reality in our kind of world. The interesting things about our cultural script of fear is the central position which global warming has within it. And global warming has become almost like a standalone, important kind of threat that's discussed in a way that is quite different from just about anything else. And it's really quite interesting because when I wrote my book, Culture of Fear, in 1997, back then, this was 27 years ago, global warming was really one amongst a number of different threats that were being discussed and which fearmongers particularly liked. But back in 1997, when you talk to environmental crusaders, they often made the point that nobody was listening to them, that the public was being far too casual about the threat. They didn't see the apocalyptic threats that were in the horizon in the way that the environmentalists did. And therefore their kind of concern was how to make their narrative of fear about global warming far more realistic and far more resonating than it had been until that particular time. And I think what's happened since then is that things have changed quite fundamentally, so that we now live in the world where the cultural script of a global warming is almost universally accepted. It's got almost a quasi-religious kind of quality to it, where it's very much seen as something that is beyond question and beyond debate. we often look at the narrative of fear about global warming and realize that it is something that young people begin to internalize at a very, very young age. It's something that they hear about, for example, when they go to nurseries. It's something that they discuss when they go to school. And virtually every single subject in schooling has got a global warming component to it. So therefore, it is not surprising that by the time these children leave school and go to university, they already internalized this narrative to the point at which it becomes seen by them as beyond discussion and beyond debate. And one of the things that I've done in trying to understand this kind of cultural script is to essentially very carefully look at the language and the words that they're using, because you'll find that there are certain terms that they use that kind of gives you almost like a signal. You know what they're going to say when they mention it. So, for example, last week, I'm listening to the Today program. I'm still half asleep. I'm still just about to make a cup of coffee for myself when I faintly hear the word wake-up call. And whenever I hear the word wake-up call on the Today program, I know it's going to be about something to do with the environment. And sure, absolutely, certainly, within a second, we hear somebody from the London Met Office say, we need a wake-up call because unless we do something, there will be no snow in a couple of decades within Britain. Snow will disappear entirely. It's almost what they really are saying is that in 10 or 20 years, unless something is done, Britain will become a tropical island. And the number of times you hear the word wake-up call. So, for example, today, there's a report just been published by an organization that's run by Dave Miliband called an International Rescue Organization. And what the report is all about is it's a wake-up call. It's a wake-up call about the climate emergencies that have broken out all over the world, which apparently have become even more dangerous and more threatening, perilous today than before the pandemic. So these kinds of words are really quite important. And in my research, I've looked at words like extinction, tipping point, emergency, sort of existential threats, all terms that are really fairly new and fairly novel. It is fairly novel when literally any kind of threat, small or big, almost spontaneously mutates into an existential threat. That's one of the key accomplishments of our cultural script about fear, is that we now almost routinized the idea of a threat being an existential threat. In other words, being a threat to our existence. And all these words like emergency and everything else are really are very much part of this. One of the things I've done is I kind of been tracking the use of these words, the changing language over the last 25, 30 years. And if you can imagine, if you can visualize it, the use of these words like tipping point or extinction or emergency is literally going up and up and up year by year, to the point at which somewhere around 2010, 2015, it just explodes. You basically get tens of thousands of newspaper headlines, all devoted to the discussion of these subjects. But what's important about the cultural script is that it doesn't simply take words, old words, and just repeat them, but it also does, it invents new kind of terms that signify the kind of fears that we ought to be having. Let me give you an example that I think is so banal, but yet so important that we often overlook it. I remember about 15 years ago, maybe 16 years ago, I was sitting in a hotel room in Milwaukee in the United States. And for the first time in my life, I looked at something I never looked at before called the Weather Channel. Have you ever heard of the Weather Channel? I never realized that it was a whole series of TV channels devoted to the weather, because not exactly the most exciting phenomenon. I'm 2 minutes into listening to the Weather Channel when I hear an expression I've never heard before, and that was called extreme weather. Extreme weather. It's an interesting idea because the term extreme weather, which is now used casually, has become an everyday concept. You listen to the news in the morning, and the weather forecaster will predict that there's going to be extreme weather, is interesting because when you actually scratch the surface, it's not a scientific term, it's a moral, cultural term. Because what has happened is that extreme weather today in the 21st century is the functional equivalent of what I used to call, or my parents used to call, when I was young, bad weather. You know, like a storm is now an extreme weather, or a lot of snow would be described as extreme weather. And the word extreme is really, really quite important in this vocabulary. And you'll find later on in my lecture that there's continuous references to extremities in the way that the script works. One of the interesting things about the cultural script that we have is that global warming has been assigned a very clear, free-floating character. When you think about it, the threat of global warming can become attached to virtually any problem in the world. Virtually any threat can become joined up with global warming. And I call this joined up scaremongering. Joined up scaremongering basically means that you take the threat of global warming and you reinforce its perilous nature by coupling it with another threat. Let me give you an example of what I'm talking about. Very recently, a UK-based advocacy group called Hope Not Hate put out a report. And the Guardian's version of this report in its headline summed it all up, because the Guardian headline said, the climate crisis isn't just causing extreme weather. In other words, we're not just talking about extreme weather. It then goes on to say, it's fueling extreme politics too. But just take a deep breath. How do you get from a climate emergency, it's extreme weather, to political extremism? I mean, that's a huge conceptual jump, but they do that all the time. So, for example, when you look at the report that's put out, it says the far right is exploiting divisions created by the climate breakdown. I don't know where they get that from. I have not seen the kind of the far right holding seminars and lectures on climate breakdown and exploiting it. But nevertheless, that's what they say. The report then goes on and says, this must be challenged, you know, sort of in scare quotes. The report then goes on to say that governments worldwide must take urgent action on climate emergency because we risk not just extreme weather, but extreme politics. It then goes on and links extreme politics to what they call the war-driven migrant crisis of 2015, the explosion of anti-immigrant sentiment, which is then in turn responsible for the supposed rise of xenophobia. Okay, so I don't know if you follow the logic, right? You get extreme weather from climate change. It's exploited by the far right. It then is reinforced by the fact that you have mass migration. And mass migration is caused presumably by climate change, and that's often argued. And this mass migration caused by extreme weather then becomes responsible for xenophobia, and then presumably, and this is also argued by some very kind of imaginative scaremongers, this of course is partially responsible for Brexit in Britain. In other words, you get from extreme weather to Brexit all in a relatively short period of time. And I've been looking at Brexit in particular. You know, I kind of wanted to figure out how is that linked to climate change. And the way they kind of bridge climate change and Brexit is by suggesting that apparently there are a number of climate science deniers, climate science skeptics who also support Brexit. So a connection is then drawn up. But it's interesting how casually these linkages are made. I mean, many of you will remember our extremely intelligent and scientifically educated Prince Charles when he declared that the war in Syria was caused by climate change. I mean, idiocies like that, somehow this horrible event in Syria, which can be explained in all kinds of geopolitical terms, you know, by the radicalization of Islam and a variety of other factors, all of a sudden that's not the main cause. It's climate change that is causing it. You probably will have heard of the numerous reports that couple climate change to global terrorism. And global terrorism also becomes very much related to that. And of course, what's very interesting is that very often the problems created by scaremongering about climate change are then seen as being caused by climate change. So Benny earlier on mentioned the fact that there's a lot of discussion about eco-anxiety among children. And there's been a whole series of debates of what can we do to protect our little children from their mental health problems, their fears about climate change. What can we do about eco-anxiety? All the while forgetting the fact that the reason why they have eco-anxiety in the first place isn't because they looked at the sky, isn't because they've been studying the science, it's because they've been subjected to relentless propaganda from the age 4 onwards about how our planet is threatened kind of routinely. But then that becomes not the responsibility of scaremongering, that is causally linked to climate change. And of course, as you would expect, the pandemic that we're all going through at the moment is also being coupled to climate change. So for example, at Harvard, the public health school has issued a report which links COVID to global warming and climate change. It's an interesting linkage because Harvard is sufficiently honest to make the point that there is no evidence yet that connects the pandemic to climate change, but they feel that nevertheless, there are suggestive linkages. So they basically argue that the ongoing conflict that has occurred around the pandemic is linked to climate change because the way we relate to other species on Earth makes a big impact on our health and creates a risk of infection. So it's really very, very interesting how this basically kind of works itself out. My kind of favorite example that I've been giving lectures on is the way in which the problem of obesity has been seen as a problem that reinforces the climate emergency on the grounds that the more people eat, the more meat that they consume, the fatter they get, the more it creates a problem for the climate and therefore causes climate change related issues. And you can almost imagine that in their minds, you have this millions of fat people who kind of refuse to walk because they're so obese that they cannot simply kind of move. They get in their car and they kind of use up a lot of energy at the same time whilst they're stuffing their face with all kinds of food. And that, of course, means that that creates a climate problem. And you have all these public health officials who basically now argue that we need to connect, we need to join up the struggle to fight global obesity with global warming. The two go hand in hand all the time. So I think that there's something here that is really important for us to realize, that this free-floating character of the threat of global warming is now become so promiscuously used that it can attach itself as a cause of virtually anything that is remotely perilous. One of the important things about the fear appeal of climate change and the script that's written around it is that ultimately it is based upon a narrative of misanthropy, what I call a teleology of evil. And in this teleology of evil, the main threat, the most important threat of all, is the threat of humanity, the human species, to the planet. So in other words, it's almost as if being a human being itself is the threat to the planet. And I often wonder, how it came to be that the term that they use, which I think is the most dehumanizing term you can imagine, which is that of human impact, is never challenged. There used to be a time when human impact, the humanizing of nature, was seen as a very positive accomplishment to do with the Enlightenment and scientific advance. Human impact today means a singular act of destruction. It's all about humanity destroying the planet. And therefore, if humanity is really such a threat, then a number of things follow from that, which I think has become pretty much institutionalized. I think the first thing which the IPCC and a whole army of non-governmental organizations are promoting at the moment, as part of their fear of both the fear for climate change, but also the fear of human beings, is population control. I think having less people on the planet is seen as being one of the most important ways in which the climate emergency is going to be overcome. But the dehumanized way in which these fears are presented almost suggest a kind of new form of original sin. The original sin of being born human is itself something that is flagged up more and more within this narrative. I remember a while back when I was in Australia, discussing the fact that some Australian doctors were suggesting that they propose a carbon tax on parents who have new babies, on the ground that every new baby that is born, sort of represents an extra amount of carbon that's going to be transmitted into the environment, and we need to somehow tax the parents to have less babies. And at first I thought this was a joke. I thought they were essentially taking the piss. I've never heard of babies being talked about in such a dehumanized way. Babies are things that we love and we cuddle and we kiss and we cherish them because they are the future of humanity. But instead, from their perspective, what they saw was not a gurgling little baby with a little smile. What they saw was this destructive force coming onto their planet and then creating more problem by transmitting and emitting more carbon. And therefore, it's not surprising that, once, whereas babies were seen as a blessing, now not having a baby is seen as being an act of virtue. I mean, just think about it, how far the climate rhetoric has gone. When instead of seeing a new baby as a kind of blessing that we all cherish, now the good thing, if you want to be virtuous, the way you demonstrate your virtue is by not having one. And there have been examples, for example, again in Australia, I don't know why Australia is so extreme in this rhetoric, where people have argued that abortion is a very good way of dealing with the climate emergency. Whereas abortion used to be seen as necessary for giving women the right to choose, it's now being recast as an antidote to the climate problem. And you'll find that there are increasingly more and more of these very negative, misanthropic ideas being floated around. I remember 11 years ago when I first began to talk about this, about the way in which the act of birth was representing as a driver for promoting existential climate fears. I was criticized by some for being carried away. Frank, they were saying, just a few doctors who want carbon tax, just a few people that are promoting abortion, just a few individuals, a few NGOs who want population control. Why are you making such a big deal out of that? That's what they were saying. Well, today, in 2020, we can see that things have gone way beyond that. We now have, for example, the bird strike movement, where a lot of young women kind of go online and very proudly declare that we are not going to have children. We're promising that our way of protecting the environment is not having children. And you have loads of young people, hopefully they will change their mind, because often when you're 22, 23, 24, you're still very foolish, who think that the way you perform virtue these days is by saying that, no, we're not going to have children because we're the kind of people that are more interested in protecting the climate than being very selfish and having children. And that kind of ideology is now promoted through Netflix, through Hollywood. It's got that is really kind of backing it up all the time. So I think that that's something that sort of we need to bear in mind. Now the question is, why is it that these narratives, which to many of us seems absurd and inconsistent and logically flawed, why is it that this narrative has had such a big purchase on society? Why is it that it's kind of grabbed the imagination and dominates public life in almost everywhere in the West? I think it's got to do with a number of factors. The first factor being that the environmentalist movement has actually succeeded in achieving something that no other movement has achieved in the late 20th or the 21st century, which is to reframe its argument in the language of morality. I mean, environmental science is essentially is a moral accomplishment, where moral values that are very strongly anti-humanist are recast in the language of science. And that has been working reasonably well, because it has managed to resonate with a kind of mood of cultural pessimism and the mood of fatalism that pervades within our society. I mean, you have to remember that since about 1980, almost every single ideology has unraveled. Communism doesn't exist. Nobody's inspired by communism. Socialism has gone to sleep. It's on holiday. Liberalism is conspicuously weak, again on the margins of society. Conservatism is very feeble, has got very little appeal in terms of our society. The one ideology that has gained momentum and influence over that time, the only one, has been environmentalism, partially because it has had no competitors, and partially because, and this is a very important point in understanding the cultural script, also because it has enjoyed an all-party consensus, so that literally every political movement, from the far left, from the Greens, all the way to the conservatives, all the way to the far right in Europe, have subscribed to one version or another of environmentalism. You know, how many times do you hear somebody in the Tory cabinet say, actually, I think that the problem of the environment is way, way inflated. You know, it's not nearly as much of a problem as you imagine it is. In fact, it's the very opposite. If Boris Johnson thinks that he's got problems, political problems, he needs to change, he'll immediately call on Carrie Simmons to come up with some plan where he will make an announcement about some new green initiative that he's putting forward. And in fact, the whole reset, the economic reset they're talking about, is very much framed within this kind of green rhetoric and this kind of cultural script that I described. So that's one reason. But an even more important reason, and something I'm really interested in discussing with you, is the fact that one of the unfortunate consequences of the fear appeals that is imminent within the cultural script that I've described is that fear encourages intolerance. Intolerance has really bloomed and flourished in the last 20 or 30 years in our society, not just in relation to climate change, but in relation to a number of other issues as well. I think one of the things that has occurred is that step by step, dissent, skepticism has become criminalized. I always remember the very first time I debated an environmentalist crusader on skepticism. And I thought that I wouldn't have to justify the term skepticism, because that's got such an honorable history, that being a skeptic was always one of the mediums through which science has advanced. But in his eyes, skepticism was almost like a modern form of original sin, that to be skeptical was necessarily a marker for being evil. And you find that the way in which skepticism has been criminalized has been quite incredible when you look at the whole history of Western culture over a relatively short period of time. But also, I think what's been very remarkable and very successful is the idea that climate change because it's so threatening, and because the threat is so obvious, is beyond debate. There is no debate on climate change, is what they say. And anybody that wants to debate climate change is more or less akin to somebody who in the past would have denied witchcraft. Now, one of the things that I remember about witch hunting in medieval Europe was that they used to argue that the people that denied the reality of witches were far more dangerous than anybody else, because denial itself led to the acceptance of what is a major crime. And of course, what's interesting about denial and the way in which the way that denial has become pathologized, even the word denial, is, and this is where its moralistic dimension comes to the fore, is denial of the global emergency is inextricably linked to the denial of the Holocaust. And in fact, the Holocaust and its denial, which is obviously a horrible thing, has become the paradigm that is then imported into the global warming discussion, so that anybody that questions the claims of environmental science is the functional equivalent of a Holocaust denial. And that's really quite a powerful, it's a very powerful moral kind of frame that they've been able to establish, to the point at which, you know, the word denial now has got such a negative resonance. People know immediately what is communicated when you hear the word denial. The criminalization of skepticism doesn't simply stop with rhetoric. It doesn't simply stop with shutting people down. It doesn't simply stop with acts of intolerance. It's also being criminalized. And that's the next phase of the struggle that all of us are going to be confronted with. So for example, as we speak, there are groups of international lawyers who are trying to amend the international criminal law to find some way or form to get a legal definition of what they call ecocide. Ecocide being a crime against the environment. And basically what they want to do is to formulate a legal language through which ecocide can be presented, so that it will complement other existing international offenses, such as crimes against humanity, war crimes, and genocide. So from this perspective, people who don't fall into the, in line with what's been suggested, don't accept the consensus on climate emergency, certainly do not behave in accordance with green ideology, can then become the targets of this kind of crime of ecocide. And if you think that this is just not that important, all you have to do is just remember what President-elect Joe Biden said the other week, not that long ago. And he basically used a term that I've never heard before, but you're going to hear a lot more. When he basically said that he has decided to label countries who fail to address climate change as climate outlaws. As climate outlaws. In other words, countries that do not accept the Paris Accord or the IPCC's sort of wisdom become, again, the functional equivalent of Iran having nuclear arms, or some terrorist state who's kind of committing war crimes. And in many respects, what Joe Biden is really arguing for, and he thinks it's a way of making himself popular, is a kind of eco-imperialism, where the United States and a number of other countries can basically impose their will, the way that they see things happening. I predict that the situation we're confronted with is going to become more difficult in the short term because of the pandemic. The language and the cultural script has expanded because of the pandemic, and all the discussions about the lockdown that we're now experiencing have become sort of reframed in such a way that people are now talking about an ecological lockdown after the pandemic. And I think it is very interesting that all the usual suspects, people like ex-Vice President Al Gore and Bill Gates, have been saying in recent commentaries that as awful as this pandemic is, climate change could be worse. Which, by the way, is what the British Prime Minister Boris Johnson said last week when he said the pandemic is bad, but not nearly as bad as what climate change is. I mean, you can really see the way that climate change alarmism is piggybacking on the back of the pandemic rhetoric and the discussions. So what do? I think those of us who wish to avoid living in a lockdown utopia in the big reset after the pandemic need to develop a convincing counter-narrative. We need to find a way of addressing young people directly, not wait until they had their propaganda sort of put into their heads and they've been brainwashed in school for 10 or 12 years, but somehow find ways and means of engaging their idealism in science and in an enlightenment way of understanding the world. We need to challenge the idea that the climate change discussion is beyond debate. And I think the way we need to do that is by actually not discussing the science all the time, not just criticizing their projections and their modeling, which obviously has got to be done, but actually standing up for freedom. I think it's really important for us that we stand up for freedom of discussion and debate. And I think that we need to forge an alliance with groups campaigning against the lockdown on free speech. I think it's important that we engage with those groups who are, in a sense, confronting the contemporary moment where tolerance and freedom is being shut down. I think we need to join an alliance with those individuals who are trying to fight cancel culture in all of its different forms, because just as they have a problem in relation to the freedom of speech and in relation to the freedom of expression, so too we have a problem in relation to our ability to basically voice our skepticism, to voice our concern, the way in which environmental science is being perverted. And I think that we need to do that in such a way that we appeal to people's sense of idealism by actually trying to popularize very important concepts. I think, to me, when I look back at human history, it's always been those moments in history where risk-taking and experimentation and a resistance of fatalism was strong that democracy flourished. There is no more of a risk-taking culture than that of ancient Athens, where democracy was born. Risk-taking was very much to the fore in the Italian city-states in the Renaissance. And at that point, that was the most open-minded, tolerant part of the world. In 19th century England, with the Industrial Revolution, we had, for better or worse, the most democratic society in the world at that particular time. I think we got to get across the idea that freedom, democracy, tolerance, and skepticism go hand in hand. And they are the foundation on which a future-oriented enlightened society is built. And regardless of what we think about environmental issues, they got to be the ones that we stand up for and fight if we're going to be able to kind of counter the ideology which is destroying and dehumanizing our planet at the moment. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Furedi. It's been a really interesting talk, and we're going to move on to some questions from our audience members next. Just as a tip for the audience, we're going to first go through some questions that have been emailed in, and then once we've gone through a few of those, we're going to invite members of the audience to say their own questions. So if you look at the bottom of your screen, everyone, you will see there's a panel, and one of the buttons says participants. If you click on the participants button, you should then be presented with an option in the bottom right corner to raise your hand. So if you could raise your virtual hand, as it were, and then I will be able to bring you in one by one later on for some questions. But first of all, let's look at some of the questions that have been sent in by our readers and followers in advance of today's lecture. The first one comes from Gordon Ratton, and he says, it seems that everyone at every level makes statements like tackle climate change or fight climate change or some other variation. And to a skeptic, that seems very simplistic, naive, and not scientific at all. It allows the listener to put whatever meaning they want onto the words, which hardly leads to a clear understanding. So his question is this a deliberate confusion so that we are left with just a binary choice and not allowed in a spirit of free discussion to explore all the nuances to be found with regard to the environment and energy use?
Well, if we understand that climate change ideology is really an ideology of evil, which is really about fighting evil by good people, there really isn't an equivalence. There isn't very much room for anything in between the two, because either you're on one side or the other. And it seems to me that one of the most important strategies pursued by climate crusaders has been to eliminate the possibility of raising questions and debate. And that's something that they both believe in, but also that's something that they've quite successfully constructed as part of their political strategy. So in that sense, it's had the effect of creating an ideology where a lot of people actually think that to question the dominant version of a climate emergency is akin to questioning God in a medieval society. There isn't room for subtlety or nuance under those kind of circumstances.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Joe Oliver, and he says, given the long history of failed projections by computer models, how are alarmists able to continue to build public support for their extraordinarily expensive policies?
Well, if you know anything about history, we know that one of the things about apocalyptic thinking is that they kind of kept on predicting throughout throughout the medieval era that the earth was going to end, and religious thinkers have always said, the earth is nigh, the world is going to come to an end, and there were all these years when it was meant to have happened. And yet, because apocalyptic thinking, has got this kind of moralistic dynamic to it, when people realized that the earth, in fact, was still kind of there and hasn't come to an end, it didn't mean that they now said, well, we now no longer believe when somebody else makes those kinds of projections. All that it basically meant was that somehow, in this particular instance, the year was not quite right. They got the figure wrong. I think it is kind of quite fascinating that no matter how many times apocalyptic thinking fails to make a prediction, and realize that prediction, nevertheless, people still believe in the next round of projections.
Thank you. Our next one comes from Richard Wollaston, and he says, the narratives behind the COVID-19 and climate change existential threats are based on particular scientific views that their proponents zealously guard from any challenge. Public policy responses based on these narratives include the use of psychological techniques designed to make people accept them. In the context of individual relationships, where one person seeks to manipulate the other by immersing them in a false context, such behavior is sometimes deemed as abusive and referred to as gaslighting. So should individuals in a free society have recourse to the law in order to prevent such techniques being used? And are we in the UK able to rely on our unwritten constitution to ensure that such legal challenges will be fairly judged? And it seems that some of the narratives in question are becoming embedded within judicial and administrative processes.
Well, I think that unfortunately, fighting an ideology cannot be done by legalistic means, because there's already far too much process and far too much regulation over the way we interact. And if we go down that road, I think we'll find that we're not going to be able to occupy the moral high ground, because we become pretty much like our opponents in relation to that. And therefore, I would like to see the judiciary, sort of clearing out of this debate. This is not a debate that should be juridified. This is a discussion that should be taking place among citizens in society. And I think the really important thing is to be able to have clear enough arguments that can expose the different psychological techniques and the different way in which moral terror is being promoted, particularly by the media. I do think it's quite important that we look at, for example, something like Netflix. I don't know how many of you ever get a chance to look at Netflix, but so many of the programs that they have there send the same one-dimensional message, which is, sort of be careful, be scared, be worried. Why aren't you more responsible? We just need to find ways and means of challenging that, because at the end of the day, there is no other power than the quality of our arguments that can win the day. We can't really rely upon lawyers and judges to solve this problem for us.
Thank you. Our next question is about predicting the future. So Max Berren asks, what do you think that the special features of the global warming issue are that give its models and modelers a free pass from the dubious reaction that generally greets experts with their attempts to forecast the future?
Well, I wish it was true that it's only in the environmental area that these foolish projections are taken seriously. I mean, all you got to do is look at someone like Niall Ferguson in relation to the pandemic discussion, where you make all these crazy predictions. And the point is that, when the projection proves to be false, then they always have recourse to argue that the reason why it didn't happen is because we've taken precaution, or something was done by us to kind of make sure that it wasn't really realized. And unfortunately, as long as there is no alternative to the science, not science, but the science as the final arbiter of wisdom, then their projections and their kind of modeling is going to have a disproportionate amount of influence, even though, as we all know, these are models that are speculative, educative guesses rather than anything else.
Thank you. Our next question comes from a teacher, Paul Illett, and he says, as a teacher, I have found it difficult to even raise moderate criticisms of climate policy and climate alarmism without experiencing considerable pushback from parents and other teachers. So what are your thoughts on why it's so difficult to question environmental narratives without being classed as a heretic or a denier, and not being allowed to engage in a reasonable debate?
Well, I agree. I mean, I've had a lot of experience, both in schools and in universities, in dealing with this. And I think it's difficult for a lot of teachers, especially young teachers whose position is insecure. But I think that if teachers can use a bit of humor, if they can be a bit subversive in the way they teach their subject, because after a while, there's a sense in which it's a bit like in the old days when people got religion all the time. A lot of people got switched off. A lot of kids stopped listening. So too, I think that kind of approach can be used in schools, where basically teachers almost kind of bring to the attention of young people, aren't you getting sick and tired of hearing about this all the time? But I think the really important thing is somehow to be brave. I think parents have a very special role in this. I remember the number of times I used to get into arguments. So my favorite story of all was I go to the rugby to watch my son play rugby, And this woman comes up to me. She introduces herself. I'm a new mother and everything else. I say, hello, how are you? Blah, blah, blah. We're looking at the children playing rugby. And she says to me, you know, Frank, there's actually a father in this school who doesn't believe in climate change, global warming. So I look at her, I says, that would probably be me, sort of. And I kind of begin this discussion. All of a sudden, all the parents kind of join in. And I think they were so surprised that anybody would own up to being a skeptic that they couldn't argue, because they never actually had to argue with skepticism. It's not something that they ever, in everyday life you kind of meet, kind of encounter. So I do think that parents have a very important role to play. And, the organization that's kind of supporting this lecture ought to be, if they got the resources, putting a lot of work into schools and children, and finding ways and means of making our view of the world, our skepticism, attractive to the young. I think the young are attracted to skepticism. They don't just want to get a line. They don't want just want to say yes sir, no sir. They're up for a little bit more than that.
Well, I think I should mention at this point that one example of a teacher who's doing exactly the kind of positive things that you were talking about is Wojciech Poza, who's the head of chemistry at the London Oratory School. And he was kind enough to invite me to come and speak to the students about what the different arguments were about climate change policies and why they should have a broader opinion. So as far as I can see, he's doing a really excellent job there, and we need more teachers like him to inspire their students to be open-minded and to see both sides of the discussion. I'd like to just ask one question of my own right now, which is, when you were looking at the issue of climate change, sort of what opened your mind to the topic? What made you more skeptical about it? Coming from a sociology background, it's obviously an issue that's become very dominant in the public discussion, but what prompted your initial skepticism, as it were?
I think in my case, what it was, when I heard this kind of a non-stop, relentless propaganda being put forward about a subject that I knew nothing about, because I don't understand, sort of the science of climate. I'm not a scientist. But when you hear people, sort of denouncing skeptics for being skeptical, and when you hear people use such intemperate language without any kind of restraint, I became interested. Why is it that this issue seems to attract such moral passions, which you usually reserve to some kind of quasi-religious kind of cause? And that's how I got initially interested and involved in this. And at some point, I think I began to realize that there was something very important going on here, because the debate on climate change is about something that's far more than the climate. It's far more than about the science. It's far more about the green energy. It's really about what it means to be a human. I mean, that's ultimately what it's really all about. It's ultimately a debate about whether human beings are on balance constructive or are we destructive. Whether human beings and the legacy of humanity is something that we should celebrate or something that we should feel embarrassed about. And I think when you see it in those terms, as a humanist, you have no choice but to take up the battle and do your bit to try to kind of question these kinds of hysterical teleologies that have been advanced.
Thank you. So our next question is from Richard North. And he says that politicians that have embraced a risk-averse approach that has curtailed people's liberties, such as Jacinda Ardern and Nicola Sturgeon, seem to have actually been rewarded with public support. Why is this, and how can we change hearts and minds?
I think it's for the same reason that politicians who are arguing for more lockdown are more popular than those who are calling for more economic activity. Politicians who are demanding more regulation of our life, demanding more safetyism, are more popular. I think there's a number of reasons for that. I think that ideologically, economics and economic activity is seen as bad. there's something wrong with economics. That's the way it's kind of publicly seen as a result of the way that our culture works. Whereas anything that is almost kind of culturally the counter of economic, particularly of efficiency, is seen as having some positive attributes to it. So we live in a world where, for example, productivity, economic productivity, which in my days was seen as important, because the more you raise productivity, the more society has resources to live a better life. Now, productivity and production have acquired these very negative connotations. And if you then come out and basically say this is not, important, it's not as important as in saving the seals in the Antarctic, or in doing some good things for the forest in this and that country, I think that's going to have a certain degree of popularity, particularly among the younger generations who have imbibed this particular ideology to the point at which it kind of almost like evokes an automatic response on their part of supporting anybody that is personifying the environment in a kind of positive way.
Thank you. And finally, from our email questions, we have Professor Richard Lindzen, who says, Orwell, observing the totalitarian movements of his day, recognized the role of both hate and fear in anesthetizing rational thought. Do you see any similarities in the institutional treatments of COVID and climate?
I think I do. I think there's a kind of soft totalitarian impulse that's at work, where if you raise any questions about COVID, then you immediately are accused of putting to risk public safety. If, for example, you argue that we do need to maybe get back to the economy a little bit, you get accused of being irresponsible. There's a kind of sort of sense in which what's being argued is that lives matter, as if somehow economics is not about lives, and not about living. So there's a kind of very strange way that this has kind of come together. And I think in that sense, definitely I think that this is this kind of soft totalitarian moment, which is reinforced so powerfully in the media, does play a really important role.
Thank you very much. We're going to go to questions from our live audience next. So I'm going to invite Sammy Wilson, MP, to take the first question.
Let me see. Hold on. I'll unmute you. Hello, can you hear me?
I can, yeah.
Okay. This week, the government published its energy strategy. It was, even though it is going to have devastating economic impacts on the economy and on individuals, it was almost universally welcomed across the floor in the House of Commons. I think because people have bought into this climate change agenda and arguments. So could I ask, do you think that one of the strategies that we ought to be using is, rather than simply allowing people to think about the government tackling climate change, spell out to individuals, this is what it's going to mean to you in terms of your freedom to travel, your freedom in what you eat, your freedom in the choice of transport that you pick, how you heat your home, and the costs, of course, involved in that. Have we spent enough time really spelling out to people the dangers that lie for them personally in this kind of broad brush agenda that somehow you've got to save the world by changing, by the government introducing all of these measures to deal with climate change?
Well, I totally agree with you. I think this relates to the point that I was trying to make about freedom. The freedom to live in accordance with our inclinations, which basically mean that if you like to eat meat, then eat meat. You don't need to be guilty about it. If you like to drive your car, then drive your car. If you want to travel to Portugal, then travel to Portugal. I mean, all these things are the gift from the past of humanity. And if we're now going to say that what the legacy of the past and all the gifts and resources that we received are somehow a curse, then what we are really saying is that we basically become an unfree society. And that's really the argument, because, you know, just like under the lockdown, a lot of people argue that freedom is overrated, that freedom is just another word, that's not that important. What's more important is to be responsible for the climate or for this and that. And I think that we got to spell out that freedom is really about living freely. And living freely has got all kinds of different dimensions to it, which the environmentalist movement is trying to curb and prevent. So I do think that there's a very important argument there, and we haven't been very good at making a very strong case about that. We just very often get stuck in a certain narrow debate about models and projections, rather than about the passions of everyday life, the things that really touch people. They're the ones that we have to get at. And I think some people in the United States have been much better at doing that than we've been here in Europe.
Thank you, Frank. Next, I think we'll go to someone who seems to have been generating a lot of debate in the chat. Now, we don't shy away from debate at the GWPF, so I'd like to welcome Zoe Young to put a question to Professor Furedi.
Hi.
Hi.
I don't know if you can hear me now. Great.
Yeah.
Thanks. Yeah. I'm just interested. You've just said that you don't have any expertise in science. You're not a scientist, and that you want to move people. So why are you talking about having a debate about findings within science? I mean, if you want to move people, do poetry. I mean, I don't know, be an actor, be a far-right leader. I mean, you used to be far left. I'm not quite sure where you are politically right now, but it's kind of intriguing that you think that you can't be critical within scientific debates, when that's actually what scientific debates are all about. I mean, science itself is organized skepticism. So it's all about being skeptical. But, you know, if you turn up to an argument and you don't even have the basic understanding of what the thermodynamic laws, etc., they're talking about, then yeah, it's going to be quite difficult to have a meaningful conversation with you. If you want to if you want to move people, then go ahead, but don't expect to do that in a scientific context, because it's, you know, you're an academic. I'm just very confused as to how you're behaving as an academic, speaking about a topic which is clearly not your field of expertise. Thanks.
Well, I think there are two different issues. There's a debate in science, of which I'm not a part of because I haven't got the authority or the graphs to play a meaningful role, which is not to say that I'm not interested in it and I don't follow it, but that's not where my debate is. And then there is another debate, which is about, now that this is what we're getting from science, what are its implications for society? What are the policy consequences that come out of this? And I, as an individual academic, I've got just as much right as you or anybody else, as a citizen, to get involved in a debate about what science tells us, because there's a distinction between the scientific discussion and debate that occurs within the domain of science and the discussion of what citizens make of those of the evidence and the conclusions that science gives us, so that we can work for ourselves. How do you want to go forward as a society? Sort of what kind of decisions we want to make about the way we live our lives. And I think to that extent, I have every right, and not only every right, but a duty to take part in discussing them. So for example, when somebody tells me that there is no two sides to an argument, that you can, there's no debate on the question of climate change, I, as a Democrat, have got an obligation to say that there's always two sides to a debate. There's always always more than one way of interpreting a scientific finding, because science is really about the contestation of different sort of research findings. And it seems to me that there's a danger that we give science the authority to make decisions about domains of human experience, which is not appropriate for science to do. Science should stick to science. Others should stick to making debates and discussions in public life. And I think that not to see the difference between the two at a time when so much of our freedoms are being put to question underestimates the issues at stake for me as an academic, but also as a citizen. I mean, I'm both. And as an academic, I'm here as an academic that's been studying the narrative that surrounds climate change, the claims that are being made, the way that fear has been recreated and constructed around climate change. And for that, I don't have to understand thermodynamics or anything of that sort. I really got to understand society and culture and the way that cultural scripts are constructed.
Thank you. I think we've got about time for about 3 more questions. So I'm going to come to Melvin Newell next, who I think has been having his hand up for quite some time now.
I didn't ask a question as such. I made the comment, Frank, I'm an alumnus of UKC, whether you were just playing with vocabulary as much as the sort of social science involved.
Well, I like to play with vocabulary. I must be honest about it. I'm intrigued by rhetoric and the language that people use. But the reason why I'm interested in language and words is because they communicate a certain set of assumptions. Words, when you hear a certain word, it kind of conveys meanings that drive people and influence the way people behave. So if people hear the word emergency or climate emergency time and time and time and again, the idea that we have an emergency becomes a taken for granted assumption. It's not something that you need to even argue for or discuss, because you heard it so many times. And when in addition to that, different governments are also declaring a climate emergency, that reinforces that. Now, you might argue that when a government says we now have a climate emergency, it's a performative sort of accomplishment. They're just kind of performing, we too are righteous, we are declaring a climate emergency. But by doing that, you are basically not only changing the meaning of an emergency in the way that I understand it, but giving a sense of precariousness, a sense of anxiety and insecurity to our existence. And that's something that's got a psychological impact on the individual, but it's got a cultural impact over society as a whole. So these words aren't just simply words, they have very important consequences for the way they shape and influence everyday behavior and everyday human interaction.
Thank you. I think next we'll go to Jean L'Espérance.
I think her mic's not on.
Jean, can you unmute your microphone?
It's still not on. I can see.
Okay, I will go to the next question. Let's go to do we have, yes, Lady McCall.
I think the same problem. Yeah.
Here we are.
Thank you. I enjoyed that very much. It was very, very helpful indeed. Incidentally, I'm not Lady McCall. I'm her husband. My question is simply this. When you go into schools and you talk to people, children really like data. And it would be very helpful to have sort of 10 points readily available. For instance, that there was global warming in the 16th century, and it's cooled down again. And the present heating is just 0.9 of a degree. And also the third thing is we've had lockdown and CO2 levels have gone down, but nothing else has happened as far as I'm aware.
No, I agree with that. I think data and some striking bits of information are really quite important to kind of capture their imagination. And I totally agree with that. And in fact, I very often use history and historical examples of major climatic change and the way that society has responded to it, to give them some kind of a context from which to then make sense of the current predicament that we're faced with.
Thank you. I think we've got time for just one more, perhaps. So Lembit Opik, would you like to ask the next question?
I think it's muted at the moment. Yeah.
Can you unmute?
Can you hear me now? Yeah, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, Harry. Given the apparent willful dismissal of basic facts like the medieval warm period, for example, totally absent in the infamous hockey stick, the obvious disconnection between climate behavior and CO2, if you look back at the longer term history, an apparent virtual total ignorance of the Milankovitch cycles, which strike me as rather important. How do we get back to a science-led global agenda on macro issues such as climate?
It's a very good question. I really struggle with that because a lot of this goes back to what schools and universities teach, and the way in which science has taken a very ideological turn is a very disturbing development for all of us within society. So it is very, which is why I sometimes think that, that we just almost need to organize day schools. We need to organize, sort of events, special events, where we organize debates on the climate for young people, where they get presented with the arguments that are scientifically based, rather than just simply being the kind of prevailing wisdom put forward in a prejudiced form. But I do think it's a very important issue. Myself, I think that there needs to be a division of labor between scientists that are very good communicators, who are able to magically turn their science alive and really kind of bringing people, and people like me who are hopefully able to relate to young people's idealism and harnessing that idealism to the question of freedom and tolerance, to listen to arguments and debates. And in fact, one of the most important ways in which you can do that is by cultivating young people's interest in arguing and debating and seeing that as being something that's important in its own right, and rehabilitating skepticism as something that is, rather than being a problem or a crime, is actually essential both for the scientific enterprise, but also for a democratic society.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Furedi. I think that's a really optimistic, hopeful-looking message to finish on. And indeed, we all need to go away and fight that battle, make the case for skepticism, debate, and reason in the face of all these wins that we're facing in terms of climate and both COVID restrictions on people's activities. So I'm just going to hand over to Benny next to say a few closing words.
Yes, thank you very much, Frank, for a brilliant lecture, very educational, very enlightening. The fear politics and this scaremongering obviously is a game of playing with fire, which can easily backfire. And people need to realize that the fear is twofold. One is the fear of what environmentalists are claiming, but the other is the fear of actually losing your livelihoods and your standards of living. And a lot of the policies being adopted in the name of climate change are threatening people with their standards of living, with the price of energy, with their cost of heating their homes. And I think if rational arguments have a hard time currently, economic worries and hardship might actually help people to think through very carefully about these policies. So thank you for a brilliant lecture, and I hope we will have you engaged in this debate more often in the future. Thanks a lot, Frank.
Thank you very much.
Thank everyone for joining us.